Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the last Toolkits Live session of this season. This is the way through with Micaela Sahhar. I'm dialing in from stolen Wurundjeri country this evening and pay my respects to First Peoples in the audience who might be streaming in either live or after the fact. I encourage you all to share in the chat where you're located right now, and I wanted to ask Micaela, where are you dialing in from?
I'm also dialing in from Wurundjeri country, the Eastern Kulin nations, and I want to acknowledge that these lands are unceded, and I think that's something, I mean, for me and maybe also for you, Hasib, that we maybe think about a lot given the context that we come from. So, I pay my respects to anyone in the audience or listening in from that nation and from other First Nations around this country. Yeah.
Thanks, Mick. A little disclaimer, you might have heard my cat in the background while I was just starting the session, and Mick, I know yours is also meowing. I just heard it. So just as a little warning to those watching, that's what that background noise is. We'll try to ignore it if you can also try to ignore it. Fred's just jumped up and might knock over a vase in a second. So anyway, I am Hasib Hourani. I am the Toolkit's nonfiction facilitator this season. And I thought I'd share a little bit about myself and my relationship to the industry to get us started. So I've been living in so-called Australia since 2016, publishing my work since 2019 and teaching since 2021. I write nonfiction, poetry, and a little bit of literary criticism. And I've asked Micaela to join us today to have a little chat about our respective practices and what that journey has looked like for each of us. So Micaela is an Australian Palestinian writer and educator. Her poetry and essays have appeared in the Griffith Review, Overland, Cordite, Southerly, and The Age, and her commentary has appeared in The Conversation and Arena Quarterly, among others. She has been a guest co-editor of Rabbit, a journal of nonfiction poetry, and was commissioned to contribute to Forensic Architecture's Cloud Series exhibition at UCS Gallery in 2020. She was shortlisted for the Blake Poetry Prize in 2014 and was a Next Chapter Fellow at the Wheeler Center in 2022. She's a recipient of support from round 7 of the Neil Sidney Literary Travel Fund, and I believe just got back from that travel. Welcome back, Mick.
Thank you.
I've got some quick Toolkits related housekeeping before we get the session started. So Toolkits Connect is a 12-week program for writers aged 30 and under to develop their skills in a unique and exciting online environment. Toolkits is run by Express Media, and Express has been around for over 30 years, developing, supporting, and promoting young writers through workshops that develop skills, through opportunities for constructive feedback and publications such as VoiceWorks, and through awards and programs that recognize excellence. Toolkits is generously supported by Copyright Cultural Fund and Australia Poetry. And this session will be available on YouTube as a resource after the fact and will be captioned in the coming days. And if you'd like to ask any questions, which we do encourage, you can do so on Twitter using the hashtag EMToolkits or via the live chat session on YouTube. So feel free to ask any relevant questions as they come up while Mick and I are talking. We'll also have 10 or 15 minutes towards the end allocated specifically towards Q&A if you don't get the chance to ask while we are going. That's it. This is not where I wanted to start, but Mick, just reading your bio, I hadn't realized that you were shortlisted for the Blake Poetry Prize in 2014. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that poem and what it was about and how you had submitted and what it was like to receive that email saying that you've been shortlisted?
Yeah. Gosh, that's an interesting place to start. I remember a lot of people friending me on Facebook when I was shortlisted for that.
Interesting.
And actually I think that happens whenever your name appears in something, you get, a few people sort of making contact with you, although not often not acknowledging that contact. So the poem, actually, it was interesting. I hope everyone here is far more confident and maybe aware of opportunities than I have been. Maybe I'm getting a bit better now, but I've also been around in the scene for a long time in various ways. I think that particular application was actually strongly encouraged by an artist friend of mine who was aware of the Blake Art Prize and suggested that I submit to the Poetry Prize. I had a poem that I'd just written in a kind of occasional poetry practice that I was maintaining alongside other work. And actually, when that happened, it was one of those moments, I think, that kept me hanging in some ways by the skin of my teeth into writing. So maybe to go back a little bit. So when you describe your writing practice, Hasib, and you say in 2016 this happened and in 2021 this happened, and you've got such a logical and concise way of talking about the development and the arc of your writing practice. And actually, for me, as you were saying those dates, I started thinking, my God, I mean, apart from revealing my age, if I start trying to think about when was the first significant thing I had published, probably actually it was a poem in The Age in 2005. And it wasn't really the start of a lot of publishing at all, I think, because opportunities were different. But it was at a moment when I thought of myself very intensely as a writer. I mean, I would tell people that I was a writer. I was studying a combined degree. It was very unclear to me vocationally what I would be trying to do when I finished it. But in 2005, I also did an honours year in creative writing. So I had this very strong sense of myself as a writer. And I had published very little. And around 2005, I did get a number of things published and thought very hard about doing a creative writing PhD, which didn't happen. And I ended up doing a PhD in something related to me, but also quite different. And it took me very, very far from my writing practice. So I think with the Blake Poetry Prize, in being encouraged by someone to submit a poem and to have that poem shortlisted, it was one of those little things that kept me somehow in a relationship to a writing scene that I think I had felt had been very hostile, particularly to the subject matter of what I did. That particular poem actually was a memory from the first time I'd gone on a big overseas trip, and I'd stayed with a friend and her boyfriend, and we'd been very, very close friends, and for reasons that were very hard. We were very young. I don't know what happened exactly, but I was trying to imagine what happened. We'd had this sort of freezing over of relations throughout that travel experience, which in some ways is a very common story, but it had hit me about 10 years later as this sort of quite painful loss. I don't think I'd experienced it as such a painful loss at the time, but it was actually in describing this kind of loss to a friend who was traveling, who was having a very, very difficult time with a travel companion. And I thought, my gosh, I had this very significant loss, and this sort of freezing over where no one's quite able to articulate what the issues are, and yet you feel them so keenly at the time. And they're so, it's sort of like chipping away at something and then you break it without having meant to, and it's having just actually come back from a trip and traveling with my partner, which is, established relationship. We've traveled together before, but even the little tensions that come out in something that's very solid, where we know each other very well, you can see how much more fragile things can come to pieces in ways that you can't possibly explain. And so that was really what that poem was about. And it was actually a lot of what I write about really has a affective undercurrent to it. It's often political, but not always. But there's definitely a kind of a fascination in human relations, which maybe is because I don't understand them very well. I mean, I think I'm sort of I don't want to be too cliched as a writer, but I often don't understand why things start to not work. And I think as a writer, that's the place that you have control over, is trying to name what it is in in your life that you haven't understood, and it's the opportunity to come back and try and honor it. I think to honor that was a meaningful thing, but also something that it sort of dissolved, like without, and there was nothing left to hang on to even put back together. It was just this sort of the disappearance of something. And I think as much as that poem was a little bit atypical of my work, when I think thematically it was very much part of a whole arc of obsession in some ways around human relations. And not
interesting. Yeah, it does sound, it's interesting because I do think that conceptually, you're right, it feels so different to the stuff of yours that I have read previously. But then when you frame it in that way, that it is about that interaction, because what I have read is so much about dynamics between people and things and positioning. It actually makes a lot of sense. And am I right in saying that the Blake Poetry Prize is specifically poetry that is around like God and spirit? And is that right or no?
Yeah, I mean, it's a loose definition, I think.
Okay, because I was going to ask how that worked its way into the poem, which
well, actually, I was really obsessed at the time, and this obsession has, to an extent, now left me. It's one of the few obsessions that was maybe a marker of youth more than of ongoing kind of energy. But I was really, really fascinated for a very long time with the woman on top kind of art trope. So thinking about Judith and Holofernes, and also Salome. So Salome is not part of that woman on top sort of trope, but she gets muddled up actually in the history of Western art, because there are a lot of images of Judith that get confused with Salome, and vice versa. For people who don't know the stories, Judith is sort of a biblical figure who cuts off the head of a sort of aggressor to mitigate the situation for her people. And the Salome story is a sort of a different story, really quite a disempowered character, I think. It was kind of famous actually for the seven veiled dance, right? So kind of an erotic figure rather than a kind of warrior figure, if you like. And so the poem was connected to that. I think this is the kind of imagery very much associated, I think, with that particular trip as well, that I had in Italy. I mean, I don't want to get too tangential, but also Salome, Oscar Wilde famously wrote a play, Salome, in French after he'd come out of prison. It was illustrated by Aubrey Beardsley. I became quite obsessed actually in Italy and trying to find an English translation of that. So there were a lot of threads of connection, although maybe not such coherent ones. But the poem itself does have a reference to the sort of the king to whom Salome is sort of tethered through her stepmother. So there was a elliptical relationship, if you like, to the central requirement of the Blake Poetry Prize. And I think it's actually worth maybe as young writers thinking quite hard about where your work might have an opportunity, even if it's not central to your work. I really wasn't sure if that work would be taken as sufficiently related. I was genuinely stunned when it was shortlisted, and in some ways, I guess, it's a retrospective argument for the connection that the work demonstrated with the kind of spiritual elements that it was meant to display. But I'm not sure if I was absolutely sure that they were there. But
I mean, I think it's worth mentioning as well, just like for early career writers, that these themes are often quite loose. Like I do submit to places wondering whether or not it's on theme, and even prefacing by saying, I have this, I don't know whether it's on theme, but I thought I'd send it your way anyway. And there often is a connection, just because, and especially with a genre like poetry that is quite abstract and subjective. So
I mean, to maybe put in there too, I think when I was doing the guest editing for Rabbit, and
Mhm.
have a theme, and the theme that I was guest editing for was reportage. And
Mm.
actually, and I did this with Kent McCutter, and you get a lot of submissions, and there are a lot of recurrent themes because people had taken that prompt in quite literal ways. And you might publish a couple of the better end of that very literal interpretation of the brief. But in some ways, you're very excited to do the creative work to see how someone else's poem might
Mm.
fit with the
Yes.
brief. Um, and I feel like some things that you end up publishing, it's almost it's your own creativity and linking it to the call,
Mm.
that sort of brings maybe the excitement of the issue, um,
Yes.
to bear a little bit.
Yeah, that's such a good point because otherwise an issue would just feel really one note if they were all, um, very explicitly responding to a certain theme.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I mean, I think reportage and that was all happening during the
Mm.
long lockdowns in NAM. And so the
Yeah.
number of sort of isolation type poems, for instance, that were submitted, which were clearly what was in the news, and also bushfire poems. So these
Yeah.
very, these were kind of the two big news items that had really troubled
Mm.
local writers
Mm.
over the period of time before the call out, and that was the poetry that people had to send
Yeah.
in. And we did
Mm.
publish that poetry, but we were excited perhaps for other
Totally.
interpretations more than the literal. Yeah.
Yes. Um, I thought I'd ask, although I don't know if you remember that I said I wanted to hear a reading from you.
Oh, yeah, I did bring a reading.
Okay, great. That's good. I
Yeah,
forgot to remind you, but we would love to hear you read and maybe a bit of context of the excerpt that you're going to be reading before you get started.
absolutely. Um, so I'm going to read a little bit from my manuscript in progress, which I hope is getting closer and closer to the end of not being in progress anymore. And
Hmm.
it's quite hard as I think it's also quite hard to let things go. I think you can do the writing and then it's very, very difficult to let go of it into the
Hmm.
next stage. And I think I've become maybe a little bit obsessive in the last stage. It's probably not the context that you wanted, Hasib.
That's great context.
So look, so this is the way my manuscript is structured is that it's all in kind of short sections. So I do come from a poetry background, but I would say at the moment, at any rate, and I guess writers can have lots of identities over a writing life.
Mm.
At the moment, I would say I'm a creative nonfiction writer, but my background is poetic. And I think in some ways the structure of the manuscript is almost poetic essays, poetic nonfiction essays. They're all fairly short. Nothing's more than about 3,000 words,
Mm.
although everything's a little bit too long for a neat reading. So this is quite edited. It's from about a third of the way through the manuscript. And actually, when I started writing, I didn't know I was writing a book, but quite quickly it became clear that I was writing a book. And the working title of the book is Encyclopedia of a Palestinian Family, which probably won't be the final title. I think it sounds a little bit too much like a reference document. And,
Mm.
that's, I imagine someone in a marketing department is going to tell me it won't sell. But I think when I realized that this book was being written and that this book was very much a repository of a kind of collective and communal memory as much as my own. So I will be resisting the idea that when this book is published, it's kind of thought of as a memoir because it's not centered around me. I'm the link in the book, but I'm not the center of the book.
Mm.
And so I started calling my father every time I finished writing a section. And there were periods where that was daily, and there were periods where that was weekly or a bit longer than that. But I would call him and I would read a section, and he would find this enormously generative. It would remind him of things he wanted to tell me. He would find some of it very moving. He would want to add bits to some stories, sometimes quite tangentially, and I'd think about whether or not I could find whether there was a story and what my father was kind of offering me as another story, and where it could live within the structure of the book that I already had in me. But this particular entry or essay or section is actually a little bit unlike many of the other sections. It's about an experience that my father and I had together rather than a memory of my own or of a kind of shared or imagined memory of people and place. And I think for that reason, it's actually one of Dad's favourites. I'm not sure I don't think it's anyone else's favourite of the other people who've read my manuscript. I don't think they're nearly as impressed by the sort of emotional import of it as my father was. And I do think it's because it's about an experience that we had together. I should also just say it is a bit redacted. So I have a real kind of intertextual crab walking style, which I think for readings is maybe a little bit too embedded in its own referentiality, not just within the essay, but to other parts of the text. So I've tried to cut out enough stuff so that the reading makes sense as a story, so that everyone who's listening feels like they're getting a story that they can actually kind of hang on to as a whole story, but also still with some of that style of the kind of intertextual scrapbook. So this section is called Revenge. Revenge is a very satisfying word I have found in moments of anger, which comforts me, although I have few causes in which to use it. Revenge is a word that lingers on the palate. You try it. Revenge, that springy sound with some grip to it. Revenge, which does not do the work of its meaning half so often as the production of the word does a work of satisfaction, stamping its way around my mouth. I do not often think of the word before 2018, and since 2018, when I think of revenge, I think of a poem with this name by Taha Muhammad Ali, a minor poet, I am told, but there is nothing minor about this poem, which when I first hear it conveys to me an apotheosis of the Palestinian condition. So in 2018, I go to a play, and I go with my father and the love of my life, who I have to wait a long time to meet, and who waits even longer to meet me. And Dad is enlivened by the sight of the Palestinian community who have turned out to see this work at the now defunct Melbourne International Festival. And I have to ask Dad not to point when he recognises faces, the handsome Palestinian and the curly-haired one, friends whose names I am not sure he knows or remembers. Revenge is one fantasy among the many fantasies we Palestinians harbour, wielding our title deeds and brandishing our keys. The poem begins, at times, I wish I could meet in a duel the man who killed my father and raised our home, expelling me into a narrow country. This is a poem by a man, and maybe revenge is a masculine fantasy. And if he killed me, I'd rest at last, and if I were ready, I would take my revenge. This first verse nurtures something in my heart and in all the hearts of the audiences at Taha who are Palestinians. Yes, we think, yes, we are here, and you will not deny it when we take our revenge. In the first verse of this poem, all our bloody fantasies are recognised because you cannot negate the existence of the hands that seek to annihilate. Until I hear this verse, I do not think I have harboured such violence inside me, but it feels good to hear it, springy words stamping about, and it feels also like another great apprehension of that elusive catharsis. I wonder how this play is received around the world as it is toured and performed, and I remember a footnote I read once about Elia Suleiman's Divine Intervention. The motif in that film is a red balloon printed with a caricature image of Yasser Arafat. And I hear at its first screening in Ramallah, the Palestinians cheer and throw up their arms as the balloon swoops over Calandia checkpoint and soars high to the gold glittering dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, marking a flight path unthinkable to Palestinians with inferior West Bank permits issued them. But the poem does not finish there, and our poet has cause next to reflect on the victim of his fantasy, the victim who has victimized him. And he says, but if it came to light when my rival appeared that he had a mother waiting for him. And here Taha wends his way through all the caveats that depict the value of a life, even a violent one, to the people who love him. Here I return to the measured teaching of what it means to be a Palestinian, and to a day around a month before I submit my doctoral thesis, my supervisor and I sitting outside at a cafe on a windy day, and he is hearing impaired and cannot hear me over the wind, and I am clutching hundreds of pages of an unbound manuscript, trying to take notes and restrain the loose papers. And he says, "You know, the hatred of the colonized is neither equal nor opposite to the hate of the colonizer. And although I do not know of a study on this, I know he is right." And I think also to the other great lesson he imparts to me some years earlier, when we are sitting outside again and we are combing through the draft of a chapter, and he says, "Don't be an angry Palestinian, be a clever one." And Taha finishes his verse, "Then I would not kill him, even if I could." Revenge is a fantasy with mercurial properties, and as Taha describes it, luminous word, which is satisfying to repeat again, and I entreat you to do it, he also cuts into it like the geological dating that is done on all the layers of silt on the side of a cliff. And as I listen, I return to fantasies enshrined by Anne-Marie Jasser in Salt of This Sea, a film that encapsulates all the fantasies of the diaspora, of people like me. In that film, we watch Soraya do all the things that we dream of doing. Here she comes from America with her papers and memories, and first she says she is from there, and she argues with the Palestinian Authority, "You don't get to say with a piece of paper whether I am or am not Palestinian." And then she goes to the bank with a ledger of savings, and she says she would like to withdraw this balance. And they take her into a room, and they tell her she can't, and she says, "Well, the bank is still here." In Jaffa, she visits the house that her grandfather built, laying the stones and afterwards the tiles inside it. And the woman who lives there invites her in, but Soraya won't go. And the jurist says, "What do you want?" And Soraya is full of rage and she shouts, "What I want is my house. Yes, this is the woman I wish I was when I stand at the border between Jordan and Palestine, and I tell the Israelis that I am Australian, and I tell them that my father is after all born in Amman, and I wish I could say, you know, and I know that I am from here, but I never do say this." In the final verse, Taha reflects on what he would do if the subject of his revenge was in no way connected to the life of another, and it begins, "But if he turned out to be on his own, cut off like a branch from a tree," and the play has been building to this great recitation, and then the final sentence, "Instead, I'd be content to ignore him when I passed him by on the street, as I convinced myself that paying him no attention in itself was a kind of revenge." And what Taha does best is to explain us to ourselves, and in this luminous line to convey also for the international audiences our staggering gentleness in the face of a moment in which we might take our revenge and do not, and the staggering humility of the gentle Palestinian who defers this satisfaction, whose dream they have tended for a lifetime and walks away. At the end of Taha, the audience sits stunned for a moment before this too breaks, and they collect their coats and personal items, and one audience member is heard to say, "Quite something to hear the story of a Nakba survivor." And my dad is still seated, but then he stands and turns to me and he says, "That's me. I'm a Nakba survivor." But the crowds have drifted away, and my father grows smaller and smaller in the emptying theatre, and now there is no one to hear him but me.
Thanks, Mick. I've heard that read twice before. I cried the first time and I cried the second time. I also hadn't seen Salt of the Sea when I had heard you read this back in December, and have seen it since. And it was interesting listening back over it this time and having those references and being able to call those images to my mind. Just the way that you riff on familiarity, I think, of the Palestinian experience is great, but tangential. So I wanted to ask, you mentioned something before you started reading about this project, saying that when you started it, you didn't know that it was a book. You didn't know you were writing a book when you started writing it. At what point did you maybe realize and then acknowledge that you needed to keep the text sprawling and turn it into a manuscript? And did it start off as an essay?
It didn't start off as an essay, and I should say that in all the years as an undergraduate and honours student that I was a writer, I was doing a combined degree, which happened to be a law degree, and I never particularly enjoyed it. And I always felt like writing time was carved out oppositionally to that very demanding degree, which had very demanding reading requirements in particular, maybe is the best way to contextualize it, because I guess in some ways an arts degree is not so difficult from a law, it's not so different from a law degree in terms of what you might need to do. But when I came back to writing, it was deep COVID. I wasn't sure how precarious my work was, and I decided that I was going to revive my law degree and think about whether or not I needed, if not entirely wanted, to get a job in that profession. And so about 6 months earlier, I'd been doing a course in my winter break for law, and I'd started writing a few notes. And I mean, they could have gone nowhere. They're actually in a book next to me, not even a particularly nice notebook, but they'd just kind of grabbed me as I was doing this study. And there was a familiar feeling to that, but I didn't think about it a great deal. And actually, what happened was Anya Volich died. And her poetry had had a very big impact on me as a young student. And quite by chance, not long after she died, a friend left a whole stack of books on my doorstep during the lockdowns. And one of those books was Anya's book, Horse. And I noticed that it had been dedicated to my honours supervisor. And so I wrote to her and I said, I really didn't realise you were so close, and I'm really sorry for your loss. And what I wanted to share with her actually was my very first memory of Anya's poetry was actually also my very first memory of Marion, and sort of marrying together this experience. And I started a correspondence with Marion in which she was asking if I was writing, and I thought, gosh, I've got a few notes in a book. Why am I not writing anymore? I guess in that kind of, in the way that a lot of people were maybe examining themselves if they weren't completely losing their shit during the lockdowns here in Nam. And so it kind of started. I mean, I think I sat down and I wrote maybe 10,000 words, and they were quite unstructured at the time. I wasn't quite sure. I mean, this became the nightmare in some ways of editing, that the first part of the book actually had not been written as I later wrote the book. And so it was quite different in its approach to itself, and different in its promises, and different in what it maybe thought it was or wasn't going to be doing. And I think it was after I'd produced about 20,000 words, and I don't want to freak anyone out, but actually I wrote my draft in about 2 months.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, it's very quick in some ways, like it's an 80,000 word, give or take, book. But I could also say that I've been writing this particular book for about 20 years. In that the work that I've done in other genres, the reading I've done for a lot of things, writing and other things, and it kind of arrived. And it actually arrived in some ways through conversations with some Palestinian friends around that time as well. So I can point to a lot of little catalysts that kind of suddenly transformed ideas into a very rapid first draft of a manuscript.
Yes.
But nothing is quite that moment, because we're all a product of so many little triggers. I mean, I think another thing for me, maybe I'd written the draft before I knew you had the next chapter. But I think the other thing for me about that draft and thinking about how I could develop that draft was actually looking around at the opportunities which were available for people with the kind of problematic content that I'd always been writing about and had a lot of difficulty placing as a younger writer. I mean, I think about that time I had some poetry published in Arena Quarterly, which I tried to publish about 15 years earlier, and which was part of my sort of collection of great rejection letters, where actually people had responded very well to the poetry, but felt politically that it was really impossible for them to accept that work.
Yeah. We kind of touched on this earlier today when we were just chatting before the session started, about that, I guess, paradox of sharing or wanting to share writing that you know and you feel confident that the quality of the craft is great, and what you're saying is airtight, but not necessarily having an outlet for it. What do you think that the timing being right was a contributing factor to you working your way back into creative writing, that you knew that maybe the industry and the zeitgeist was more ready to receive the information that you were wanting to share?
I mean, I think that's true, but I also, when I think about it, I feel like I was also on the barricades for all the years in between, helping to help towards that change. I mean,
Yeah.
it's not that I wasn't, I think, so in some ways, I mean, to go back to sort of academic stuff, and I mean, doctorates are actually really quite good ways of being a writer as well. I mean, it is actually a sort of secure source of funding potentially to develop a project. Of course, you then have other difficulties around the kind of academic practice, which may or may not suit particular people's styles, and whether or not you can house your project with someone who would actually be a good mentor or a good supervisor for that work. But when I was really thinking about that, and I was very, very excited about it, but also as a Palestinian whose work was very centered by that stage. By the time I'd finished my honours year, the centering of my work had become very, very politically focused, if only elliptically. I mean, I very much hope I'm not didactic. I don't really wish in writing to tell people what to think. Maybe I'd want to tell them what to think if I'm writing a scholarly article, but not, not when I'm writing. I think that's actually not great writing, and maybe not the kind of writing I want to read either. But I think for me, I'd felt like I really had to get the credentials of a doctorate in a discipline that was not going to be that was going to entitle me to speak about that subject matter.
Yes.
In a way that I felt like a creative writing doctorate would not give me the support of that kind of content expertise that I felt I really needed. And so during that period, I mean, I became a much more active political speaker and feature writer. And I think, having relationships with journals, albeit more on a creative margin than directly creative, but I mean, I think Arena maybe in a NAM idiom is actually quite a good example. They do have some. The format has changed a lot actually over the years, but even back then they would publish a little bit of poetry, but really they were kind of political commentators. And so being able to develop writing through there. I mean, actually another, I think Hasib, but a friend of mine at the time is living with someone who's much better known now than they were then, who was editing an online journal, who read an online post of mine and actually was the person who really got me started on feature writing and really pushing on feature writing and pitching, I guess, features or commentary features, I guess, for places. And I think so. I feel like it's hard. I mean, I'm maybe it's clear from listening to me speak. I have a lot of difficulty with linearity, both in my writing and also in my accounting of myself. But I think it's not just because there were more opportunities. It's because people like me realized there were no opportunities and tried to tackle things in new ways. But I think by the time I came back, I mean, you'd had the next chapter the year before me. Our friend Sarah Sala was doing well with her writing. And so there was a sense that there was a palatability around it, or at least that it wasn't going to be opportunity ending, that you wouldn't put in a submission that had a particular focus, such as the focus that it might have, and that it would, without really being considered, it would be dismissed. So I feel like, and I think there's actually a lot of important allyships that have gone into the arguments made around Palestinianness. I mean, the most obvious one is First Nations solidarity towards Palestinians, which has been really generous and unstinting, I think. But I think there are other fights around rights that have also strengthened the position for Palestinians, but also I hope that Palestinians have strengthened that position for other groups as well, that are running arguments about how difficult it is to have to put your work forward and actually expect that it would be reviewed on its merit and not
Yes.
rejected its content.
Yes. And it's interesting that you should mention the next chapter, because I remember, and we talked about this when you were putting your application together, that when I was writing my application, I was really, rightfully so, nervous about the eligibility of my application and whether it was going to be considered a political liability for the Wheeler Center to accept it. And so, although yes, the landscape is getting better, it's still something that's like a continual process. And even in the process of pitching up your manuscript, there are obviously publications or publishing houses that we know we should steer clear of in that case. And
No,
so yeah, almost like a minefield to navigate. But
I mean, I feel like I don't want to say I feel apologetic, I don't, but if I feel like people haven't really thought about the implications of what it might mean to publish a Palestinian work, it's like I want to have a really serious conversation about that, because I want to know that if there's a problem, you're not going to send me out on my own, right? Like, I want to know that you're also going to have my back.
Totally, which is why I think, like, maybe, and this is like a good piece of advice for writers who in general are tackling topics that are maybe a little bit more precarious than others, that knowing that your publisher like has or that a journal, a particular journal, has like a stance on what it is that you're writing about, that they don't just believe it and stand by it in theory, that they can actually stand by you if anything happens, I think is really important.
I would
because
absolutely.
At the end of
oh, please finish.
Oh no, just that for a writer to stand alone without the backing of a journal or a publishing house is like maybe an imbalance of power. And so keeping that in mind when you are taking particular essays or manuscripts even to publishing houses, making sure that they know what they're getting themselves into, because they also might be a little bit naive about the subject matter and not know the kind of pushback it might receive.
Absolutely. I mean, I also think it's related, but maybe slightly on the side of that. So not so much publishing houses, but maybe thinking about journal publications. I don't pitch very much. I mean, I've just talked about pitching commentary, which is true, I did for a while, but I generally just write what I'm asked, like what I'm invited to do. It's partly because my writing is a part-time practice, but also I don't have a big name, obviously, but I have enough connections, particularly when it comes to my field, for to receive enough invitations for myself in a year to kind of round out the year. But among that, and I think it's actually worth thinking about too, was very powerful when someone said to me once, I was having a very, very difficult editing experience, and they said, you don't have to publish it. Like, you can actually take that work back. And it has made me think a lot about, if I don't like a brief, if something is not for me, then I do need to say no, because it doesn't do anyone any favors. I mean, unless you're a hot it person, and so few people in the publishing industry end up having that kind of magic around them, unless there is actually no moment that is the defining moment of whether or not you're going to have a career in writing. And so actually looking after, I don't want to say your brand, because actually it's who you are, I think. Like, looking after what your values are and what you're prepared to write, what you're prepared to have your name attached to, and saying no to things that don't feel right. Speaking engagements that don't feel like that you would be ambushed in, or that don't align with your values. Writing engagements, even if you just identify that the writing engagement is something you're interested in, but there's someone genuinely better placed to do it. And it would actually be a bit embarrassing for you to do it, and I've had a couple of writing experiences where I've realized I probably wasn't the person who should have done it, or I probably should have asked to do it with someone, or I should also
I remember navigating that early on, and it was such a learning curve of realizing that the gigs don't stop coming. Like, as long as you just keep your eye out for what's there, you can still get opportunities, even if you turning one down doesn't negate you getting an opportunity in the future. But they feel so finite at the beginning especially when you're starting out your career and trying to accrue a bibliography or have a list of, your public engagements. There is this pressure to need to accept every gig and at every chance that you get. And I remember also the first thing that I ever performed at was not great. But I was so excited that I was like, amazing, I want to be a part of this. And it was an initiative for queer Muslims, I believe, in Melbourne, that has since become defunct. But it was the audience there was like very much coming from a white savior perspective, and then a couple of the panelists were also like reinforcing this narrative of coming to the West to escape from XYZ back home. And I was sitting there thinking, oh, this experience is not my experience, and these politics are not my politics. But I was there with the light on me and a microphone in my hand, not really knowing what I'd gotten myself into. And so not only considering like that specific event that you're participating in, but looking into fellow panelists or the history of the collective that's running it, I think is also really important when you're taking on that first or those first few public engagements.
Absolutely. And I think as you build up a bit of a body of both experience, but also kind of contacts and publications, knowing who you would and wouldn't work with again. I mean, some people are such a pleasure to work with, and it may not be the best paid gig, but they're just, you really like the way that they edit, or you really like the way they give you creative control, as opposed to, I feel like I've worked with some other groups where I've had a bad experience, I've gone back for seconds and maybe tried to carve out certain rules or parameters around that, and it's gone just as badly as the first time. And thinking, okay, like it would be really stupid not to learn my lesson now,
Yes.
But maybe thinking that you can have an impact on a culture or on a writing culture, when actually you have to remember that, I guess with writing, there is a point at which you can't treat it as entirely on the clock work, but also that when you are being paid for commissions, I mean, all the stuff around it needs to go well, it seems to me, to make that a kind of viable thing to be doing.
Yeah. And what you said as well about just once you become more established, not only do you make connections, but I also think you start attracting maybe you have enough of like a public image and a brand, as much as I hate the idea of it, but it is a brand that people know what to engage you for. And so figuring that out for yourself before you start seeking publication or performance events means that you then know what to say yes and no to, before other people externally can read you and know what it is that you're looking to engage.
I think that's right. And I also just want to say, related, like, might not be elliptically related, but I think if you think about who you would like to be published with and they're not accepting your work, not giving up, right?
Yes, well, this is it.
Yeah.
Let's talk about rejections, because we've not gone through a lot of the questions that I'd lined out for us to talk about, but rejections, let's talk about them.
Yeah, I mean, I used to say with my rejections, I feel like I'm a few too many house moves away from knowing where those are anymore. But I used to have, and back in the days when you would send like a postage stamped envelope and people would return your manuscript. And for all kinds of reasons. I mean, I feel like I had a certain set of poems, which in fact I'd sent to Dorothy Porter. I'd sort of met her in a workshop and she was very excited about these poems, and I could never get them published. I mean, they didn't get published for 15 years. It was really unfortunate. But I think I was lucky. I mean, talking about rejections, the thing that I would say for me, particularly because I went through a creative writing school, if you like, is that I knew that writers thought my work was good.
Yeah.
I always knew that writers thought my work was good. I couldn't convince people to publish me.
Yeah.
And so, although there was a big disconnect there, I trusted the writers, but also felt like the writers maybe had a lot less of a handle on a kind of commercial publishing space, but that I could take faith in the really positive encouragement and reinforcement and excitement that I was getting from a writing community. But with rejections also, I mean, I sent you a rejection letter from your future or publisher, and I remember receiving it and being really quite gutted by it at the time. And I haven't looked at it in many, many years, at least not a decade, if not longer. And sending it to you to share it with you, I could see it was actually a very beautiful and very encouraging letter. And I actually think that in writing, we need to not be discouraged by those setbacks. And I feel like the person, I mean, not that anyone should be holding up Charles Bukowski as a great, model or a hero, but I actually really appreciate his story about getting into writing, which is that he really, really wanted to be a writer, and he would send out stories every other day, and he would get letters back saying it's not good enough. And Charles Bukowski underlined the enough. And so what he saw was good, but not enough yet to be published. And I think that's actually really resilient way of taking the feedback or the rejections, which you'll inevitably get. And I do think it's really important, and I'm only learning this practice now. I think when you get rejections, they're painful because your writing is very much attached to you in a way that often other elements of work are not. And it can be very hard to force yourself to come back to a rejection. But I almost think it should be diarized that after you've dealt with the initial disappointment, that you schedule for yourself. I mean, academics do it all the time with referee reports, right? Like you get a bad referee report, but eventually you have to deal with it if you want to publish that work. I think writers should actually put in their diary 6 weeks later, I'm going to reread that rejection letter and see what the good things were, because I couldn't see them the day I got them. The day I got it, it was a rejection. But 6 weeks later, maybe there's something else for me to find in that.
It's so interesting because that's exactly what happened with me. And you just mentioned my my future publisher, that I had gotten a rejection from my top choice publisher. And it was a bit of a pipe dream in wanting to publish with them, because I know that it would be the first time that they were publishing something like this. My manuscript is an experimental work of poetry that's quite tactile with specific printing needs. Anyway, but I had pitched it to them and I was like, I know that it's not your style, but I really want to work with you. And they got back to me and they said, we think it's a very ambitious work. We would love to publish it. It's not for us. But it was ultimately a very nice rejection letter in that the publisher had engaged quite closely with the work and had some beautiful things to say about the nature of the craft itself. It just wasn't right for them. But obviously I was very sad about it. But it was after receiving that rejection that I then reached out to like follow up on the publisher that I knew from the beginning in the back of my mind that was the most organic choice from a publishing perspective. And they replied instantly and they were like, thanks for the follow-up. We would love to take it. And obviously there were some critical comments on the work itself, because it does need work and it's not finished. But that was nice to receive as well, to know that even the people seeking publication can view the gaps in your work and kind of work with you to fill them in. So rejections aren't always bad or aren't always like insulting, and acceptances aren't always going to be ones of pure praise. And to look maybe at that duality, I guess, of having your work accepted or rejected is really important.
And as you get older, I think you should be suspicious actually of the pure praise, because it's, as a practitioner striving for the best work that you can publish on something that's so deeply powerful for you, or that you really care about, which is true for most people who want to make writing part of their life practice. If it's met only with praise, I mean, maybe hopefully when you publish the book it's met only with praise, but in the steps before that, I actually think someone is not pushing you or hasn't understood your work if they can't engage critically with it.
Totally. It was reassuring to know that it wasn't going to be released unless it was perfect. And that was ultimately what led to me making a decision to go with them, because I felt reassured that was the case. We've only got a couple minutes left. I thought I'd nudge for questions, and if not, I'm very happy to wrap up here. Yes, we had, just for context for everyone here, there was a long list of all the questions and topics that Mick and I wanted to go through, and we did not make a dent in them at all. But I feel like, this happens when we chat, though. I feel like we have really generative tangents, like the tangents were great. I wouldn't have wanted it any other way. Okay, I'll end it here and just say thanks everyone for listening in. And thank you, Mick, for such a great chat. I wanted to ask if you have a website or any particular upcoming work or projects you'd like to plug and promote.
I don't have, well, I have some overdue commission pieces,
Okay.
which are maybe not worth plugging it and promoting. You and I are both being published in an anthology of Palestinian Anglophone poetry in the, I hope, not too distant future. So maybe that's one to
keep an eye out for that.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. And just as a reminder to everyone watching, the session will be available on YouTube afterwards as well as a resource, and it will be captioned in the coming days if you want to go back and watch it with captions. The next season of Toolkits will be opening for applications in the coming weeks as well. So keep an eye out and just know that just because you are a participant in this nonfiction stream, that doesn't negate you applying and getting into other ones. And I can't recommend the course enough. All the streams are fantastic and all of the facilitators are geniuses. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and goodbye.